Good morning. Good to see so many people this morning. I want to welcome our visitors. We're glad you've chosen to assemble with us this morning. We're thankful for those tuning in on our live stream through our Facebook page. Welcome. Over the last few weeks, Becky and I have been discussing current events in light of the scriptures. And this morning I wanted to present to you a little bit of what we've talked about in a lesson I've called Forged in Fire. We're going to take our text from 1 Peter 4, 12 to 13. And while I'm giving credit where credit is due, I did not create this logo. I actually, as I was doing research for the illustrations that you'll see during the presentation, I came across there's a television show called Forged in Fire. I've never heard of it, never seen it, but I like their logo, so I stole it. So thank you for the Forged in Fire producers. But 1 Peter 4, 12 to 13 is our text, and I actually want to begin by reading that with you, and then read another passage in James chapter 1 that reading this one reminded me of. In 1 Peter 4, 12 to 13, it says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of His glory you may rejoice with exultation." Peter says, don't be surprised at fiery ordeals. In fact, he says, not only should you not be surprised that there's going to be fiery ordeals, as what I also call the storms of life or trials of life. He says, don't be surprised that we'll be tested by fiery ordeals that cause us to share in the sufferings of Jesus. And that when it happens, we are to keep on rejoicing. Well, I don't know about you, but when bad things happen, oftentimes rejoicing is the farthest thing from my mind, right? So what is Peter talking about here? For one, he says, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, meaning that his audience was suffering something. Some have interpreted that to mean it's persecution. We don't know what that is. He doesn't elaborate here. What he does say is that what they're going through is a fiery trial, right? It's not pleasant. It's something that's going to test them. But he says, keep on rejoicing. And as I read that, it reminds me of what James said. James said something very similar in James 1, 2 through 3 and verse 12. He says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance." And then he says in verse 12, "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love Him." So it sounds an awful lot like James is saying what Peter said, that saints are to consider trials with joy, knowing that it produces endurance, knowing that if we persevere, if our faith holds, we will receive the crown of life. He says that's where the joy comes in. Both Peter and James say that we are to rejoice in Christ. James here points to that reward, that eternal reward. But I have to ask, rejoice undergoing trials and fiery ordeals? Sounds like Peter and James were drinking the Kool-Aid, right? It sounds like they're drinking from the same vat of Kool-Aid, and we have to ask, what were they thinking? Telling us that as we go through fiery ordeals, as they tell us about going through trials that are going to test us, that we are to rejoice? How is that possible? Who of us, when we're going through something terrible or trying, wants to break out in song and have the birds singing and the light from heaven shining on you and you feel like everything's going great in that moment? That's not the kind of rejoicing he's talking about. He's talking about being able to rejoice because we know what the outcome is going to be, if our faith holds. So he says we are to keep on rejoicing. A lot is said about overcoming the trials of life. We will inherit heaven. Just 3 passages that spring to mind, but there is a host of them that even Jesus deals with. Some of those we'll reference later on. But 1 Peter 4:13, James 1:12, and Revelation 21:7. Revelation 21:7 is where John, through the Spirit, writes, "He who overcomes will inherit these things." And speaking from God, God says, "And he will be my son, and I will be his God." He that overcomes will inherit these things. What things? You go back to earlier part of the chapter. He inherits those things where it says God himself will wipe away all tears. God will remove pain and suffering and sorrow, and all these old things will be done away with, and all things will be made new. And he says, if you want that, you have to overcome. You have to overcome. You have to come through the other end of that fiery ordeal. And in the early century, in the first century, the early Christians, oftentimes the end of that ordeal was with their lives. And so Peter and James are reminding them that even if it costs your life, you're to keep on rejoicing, because you know how it ends. You know where the story ends. If we suffer as a Christian, not just a storm or trial of life, because we all go through things that have nothing to do with who and what we are, but if it's targeted persecution, if it is targeted persecution, storms of life because of who and what you are, who and what you believe in. He says we're to rejoice and glorify God in that name. That's where Peter goes later on in that same chapter, 1 Peter 4, 14 to 19. He says you are to rejoice and glorify God in the name Christian. That is a follower of Christ. One of the reasons that both Peter and James point out is that fiery ordeals produce endurance. Fiery ordeals produce endurance. Fiery trials in life make us stronger, better prepared and equipped to serve God and to be examples for others who are going through the fire. 1 Peter 5, 8 to 9, after telling us in verse 8 that Satan is a roaring lion, roaming about seeking someone to devour. He says in verse 9, knowing that your brothers throughout the world are suffering the same, you can resist him firm in your faith. There are others that are going through the same trial. There are others who have gone on before you, and you can draw on them for strength, for encouragement, and for comfort. Like metals tested in fire, the fire purges away the impurities. And if that metal is strong and survives the fire, on the other side of that, the metal comes out purer and stronger for it. That's why they test the metals in fire. They purify them in fire. So the saint, the Christian, the child of God, comes out stronger and more resilient. That's why James is able to say these fiery ordeals, these trials, they produce endurance. When you go through something that's tough, when you go through something so bad that there's times you want to just give up, when you come out on the other side of that, not only are you stronger, but you are able to be a comfort and a help and an example to others who end up going through that same thing or something similar. You end up having that sage, wise advice, right, that you can pass on to them to help them through the fire. But the hard part is enduring the trials. The hard part is rejoicing. Finding that moment to rejoice in the midst of your sorrow, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of heartbreak. But we can rejoice afterwards when we see the result. When we see the strength and the resilience that we gain after such an experience such as that, whatever that is to you. And we can see that result in others that come to you saying, I'm going through something so bad. And you say, let's talk. And you can give them advice because you've been there. You've been through that fire. Christians forged in fire become stronger and better equipped to serve God and others. And I want to share with you just two examples from Scripture that we can see that this isn't just something that we can make a nice poster. And there is a nice poster, by the way, at the end. I'm very proud of it. But these aren't just words for a nice poster. I want you to see through example in the Scriptures, and there are multitudes, and maybe you're going to be thinking of others than what I bring up, but I want to look at just two that show us that someone that is forged in fire becomes stronger and better equipped to serve God and others. And we're going to begin by looking at Moses. Moses was forged in fire. In Exodus 2, verse 11, all the way through chapter 3, verse 22, Acts 7, 20 through 44, and Hebrews 11, 24 through 29 serve as the text to where these accounts are drawn from. Moses was plucked from the Nile River as a baby and raised in the household of Pharaoh as son to Pharaoh's daughter. He was educated as an Egyptian according to their learning. This is something Stephen tells us in Acts 7, verse 22. So for all intents and purposes, his first 40 years, he's an Egyptian. He's a Hebrew. He's an Israelite, but he's an Egyptian. Born and raised, he was born to an Israelite family, but he was plucked from the Nile River as a baby. All he ever knew was the Egyptian arms, except for those years that his mother got to wean him. And she got to train him in those years. And it was enough that he knew who his people were. And it was enough that as he stands before God in the burning bush, and God says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses doesn't ask, who are they? He knows. But he grew up an Egyptian. He grew up trained in all their learning and education. When he was 40 years old, he went out for himself and he saw the mistreatment of a Hebrew by an Egyptian. And he thought himself as their deliverer. That's what Stephen reveals to us in Acts 7:23-25. He said to himself, I'm their deliverer. So he kills the Egyptian, hides his body in the sand, and he thought he got away with that. And maybe he's thinking over that night, maybe he's going over with plans in his head of how he's going to deliver the people by killing one Egyptian at a time. I don't know, but he thought himself their deliverer. But he goes out the very next day, he finds two Hebrews fighting, and he tries to make peace between them. And they recalled the killing of the Egyptian, and they asked that famous question, who made you judge and ruler over us? And when he knew that he did not get away clean from killing that Egyptian, he ran for his life. They didn't understand, Stephen tells the Sanhedrin in Acts 7:25-29. They didn't understand that he wanted to deliver them, and they mocked him for it. And so Pharaoh wanted him dead, so he flees to Midian, no longer wanting to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. How do we know that? Hebrews chapter 11, 24-27. Refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he gave up the luxury he was raised into. He recognized it as temporary, the passing pleasures of sin, and he ran into the wilderness. And he lived there in the wilderness for 40 years as a shepherd. And you can see that in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1. But you see, Moses was forged in fire during that 40 years in the wilderness. For 40 years, God was grooming him to be a leader. He learned patience as a shepherd. Sheep are stubborn. A shepherd has to learn patience to deal with the sheep. He no longer was prideful. Acts 7 verse 25, thinking that he would deliver the people in his own way. We read in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, he was the most humble man on the face of the earth. His patience and leadership skills that he learned in the wilderness would be needed to deliver and lead God's people in God's way through the wilderness for another 40 years. And it said multiple times during that story that they were rebellious, that they were stubborn. In fact, you can turn to Acts chapter 7 and see Stephen use a lot of the same language that Moses and Aaron did about the people from Exodus through Deuteronomy. They were rebellious, they were stubborn, they were stiff-necked. And while his people asked him, who made you judge and ruler over us? Stephen points out in Acts 7:35 that same man that they mocked, God made him judge and ruler over them. When he came back to Egypt and boldly stated to Pharaoh, let my people go. For 40 years in the wilderness, he must have thought he was forgotten. He ran away from his problem. He hid from the king of Egypt because he wanted him dead. He's now just a shepherd in Midian, thinking that he's been forgotten. And yet, the powerful thing to us and to him is God knew who he was. God knew where he was. And God called him when it was time. Exodus chapter 3, 1-4. Leading a flock of sheep into the mountains, he saw a burning bush that was not consumed. And out of curiosity, and I think that would have been any of us, went up to get a closer look and heard that voice, remove your sandals from the ground you stand on is holy. And thus began his commission to go into Egypt again, face the new king, and tell him to let God's people go. Moses was forged in fire to be the leader God needed him to be. And he was resilient. He didn't run from problems. He was so resilient that even with the people being rebellious and stubborn, he would stand before God. And God would say to him, stand back, I'm going to blast them. I'll make a new nation out of you. And Moses would say, remember your promises. Moses was forged in fire to be the man God needed him to be, to deliver God's people the way God wanted them delivered. The next one I want to talk about is David. David was also forged in fire. In this section, the story that we're going to be looking at is from 1 Samuel 16, 5 to 23. 1 Samuel 17, all the way to the end of chapter 18, which is verse 30. David became God's anointed while Saul, also God's anointed, was still king. David went from, this was a whirlwind story from chapter 16, especially when you get into chapter 17, through the end of chapter 18. In this whirlwind account, here's what happens. David goes from shepherd to the king's armor bearer to Israelite champion, friend of Jonathan, the king's son, so he's friends with the prince, to a captain of the king's army, to the king's son-in-law when he marries Michal, Saul's daughter. He got the girl. That's where in the movies and the stories, that's where all the stories want to end. He got the girl. He married the princess. He's in the family. He's now into the royal, not only noble blood, he's in the royal blood. From a shepherd to the king's son-in-law. And man, when you read 1 Samuel 18:30, it says, all that he did, he prospered in. His enemies feared him, and his men loved him. You'd wonder, how was David forged in fire? Everything was going his way. Well, the fire began very early on in 1 Samuel 19 and runs through 2 Samuel 2 and chapter 5. The fire came when out of Saul's jealousy of David's popularity. The songs were sung that Saul slayed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Saul heard those songs. And it tells you how much the people loved David, not just his men, the people. Remember, he's a champion of Israel. He slayed Goliath, the giant, when no one else would step into the ring. But Saul's jealousy from his popularity, his jealousy over the loyalty of his own daughter to her husband and not the king, the love and loyalty of his men. All of those things combined, as you look in 1 Samuel 19, Saul ordered the death of David. And from that time on, David's on the run for his life. He had to leave behind his wife, Michal, and he had to leave behind his best friend, Jonathan, the prince. During his time on the run, he gained other wives and 600 loyal men who came from his family. They came from the Philistines, the enemy of the Israelites, and Israelite scoundrels. To see what I mean by Israelite scoundrels, read 1 Samuel 22, 1 to 5, and you'll see that men that were in debt, men that were outlaws, men that just were scoundrels and nut jobs, they all came to David to the cave where he was hiding out in. His family, his brothers, that tells us his brothers were servants of Saul. They were serving in the army, but they left Saul to come to David. And so as he was hiding out in a cave, he gained his own family, men from the Philistines, and men from the Israelite tribes with their families. See that in 1 Samuel 22, 1 to 5, and chapter 30, verse 9. He had to live in caves with his men. 1 Samuel 22 and chapter 24. Both of these chapters deal with him living in a cave with his men. In chapter 24 and 26 of 1 Samuel, he had the opportunity to kill Saul twice, but spared him both times. And on the run, unable to be there to stop these horrible things from happening, he had to hear about the terrible things Saul did to the priests at Nob. He ended up running and living with the Philistines, living among the enemy, just to escape the hand of Saul. He couldn't be there to fight beside Jonathan, his best friend, when King Saul went out to fight the Philistines that one last and terrible time. In 1 Samuel chapter 31. And David, already anointed king by Samuel, was crowned king over Judah and Hebron, and then 7 years later made king over all Israel in 2 Samuel chapter 2 and chapter 5. David was forged in the fire. The lessons David learned as a shepherd were valuable to him as a king, leading God's people who were known to be stubborn and rebellious. The relationships he built with his men would last his lifetime. You can read of his men who were there with him in the caves, still loyal to him on his deathbed in 1 Kings chapter 1. And one of them in particular going on to serve his son Solomon in the capacity that Joab served David. The lessons on the run from Saul would strengthen David's trust in God, not tear him away. It didn't drive him further from God, it drew him nearer. And the words that he wrote are still recorded for us today that we might gain comfort from them. You can look in Psalm 57 and Psalm 142 and see the heading there tells you they were written while David was in the cave. At least 2 Psalms were written specifically when he was in a cave, on the run for his life. And indeed, there are many Psalms written during this period. He trusted in God, even in suffering the punishment for his sins with Bathsheba, when his own son Absalom rose up against him and caused a civil war that threatened to tear the nation apart. We can see King David as an example of trusting in God. The judgment against his sins and the prophecy that trouble would come to him from his own family is there in 2 Samuel 12, 10 to 11. Chapters 15 to 18 are the rebellion and civil war of Absalom. And you could read Psalm 3. And if you were to look at Psalm 3, you would see the heading there, and it tells us this is a psalm when he was on the run from his son Absalom. And as you read through Psalm 3, you read a man who's in pain. But you read of a man that his absolute faith and trust is in God. And this is judgment for his sin. And yet, even in suffering his just deserts, as we'd say today, he trusts in God. It's a lesson for us that even when that fiery ordeal might be consequences from our own actions, we need to have that trust and that faith in God to see us through. David was forged in fire to become the king and leader God needed him to be. But I don't want to just talk about Moses and David. Their stories have been written. Their life's accounts are written in the annals of history, in the record for us from God so that we can draw strength from that. But what about us today? Saints today are also forged in fire. From Mark 4, 14 to 19 and Hebrews 10, 32 to 39, there is a need for endurance. Jesus outlines the parable of the sower. And he tells us what the parable of the sower is. And then his disciples take him aside and they're asking him about that. And he tells them that he gives them the explanation of it. And he says, as he gets to the rocky and the thorny soil, he says the rocky soil, Christian, is this. When trials in the form of persecution for being a Christian, this is not just the storms of life. This is targeted persecution. He says when persecution because of the word. What word? The word that they heard, that they obeyed to become a child of God. So when trials in the form of persecution for being a Christian arise, it says the rocky soil Christian has no firm root. Remember what they do? They bail. They fall away. He uses the word immediately. They fall away. Because they have no firm root. And they're like, I want none of this. And they fall away. He also outlines the thorny soil Christian. When trials and temptations arise from, quote, the worries of the world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desires for other things, they become so distracted, so wrapped up in those things, the persecution and the storms of life, they become unfruitful. And so both of these, the rocky soil Christian, the thorny soil Christian, they're dealing with fiery ordeals. Whether it's persecution because of who they are, whether it's a storm of life, the distractions all around us. And if we think we have distractions today like no other, those distractions have always been there. The first century Christians had those same distractions. The pleasures of life were still there. Now it seems in our generation, in our time period, they're at the touch of a button. They're right at our fingertips. But mankind has always been able to enjoy the pleasures of life, both good and for bad. And the Christians, even if they are engaged in things that are wholesome and good, they can still become a distraction for bad if they make you unfruitful. Temptations will come from targeted persecution. Temptations come from the storms of life. The temptation is to cash it in, as we say, to just quit, give up, walk away. Well, that's what the rocky soil Christian does. That's what the thorny soil Christian does. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews 10, verse 39, says, saints need endurance because, quote, we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. He was talking to his audience who he says were thrown in jail for being Christians. Their property was seized, and he says they endured it all with joy. And he says, now's not the time to throw away your confidence, because you have a great reward. He says you need endurance, because God says the one that shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. He says, but we are not of those that shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. What he's talking about are saints that are forged in fire. They persevere under trial. They persevere under pressure. And when they come out of it, they're stronger for it. I want to talk about just the most recent fiery ordeal for Christians, the coronavirus pandemic. And if you're sitting here today, you might say there are many other present distresses we could talk about, and that's true. We could talk about race relations with police, things that have been brought to light that need to change. We can talk about the rioting in cities burning, some states burning. There seems to be this parentheses in our country. The West Coast, there's many states that are on fire. On the East Coast, there's states that are wet from hurricanes and in danger of flooding. We could talk about all of those things, both the negatives and the positives. But I want to stick with just one of these things and some of the things Becky and I were talking about over the last few weeks. You know, there was a lockdown of individuals, businesses, and churches. And for still a great many, for health and other reasons, are still in lockdown. They're still suffering those effects. For 6 months, all of us had to deal with government overreach in the name of health and safety. And the result has been division. Division. We had to deal with a divide in citizens applauding the government steps and others who opposed or decried those same steps. Division, where the divide was furthered from several inconsistent and contradicting reporting. Studies which say this, and then another study that says that, often from the same source, which caused some to question the validity of the threat of the virus, and others to take it very seriously. There was division. Some thought that some questioned the origin of the virus, giving way to conspiracy theories, while others used personal anecdotes to validify the claims, and this is done on both sides. Division. Some divide over whether to wear masks or no masks. And that divide has been only getting worse and worse and has crept into the Lord's church, where brethren treat other brethren, regardless of what side they fall on, with unkindness, intolerance, and impatience. We need to show love for one another. Let us not let Satan divide the body of Christ over these things. But there has been division. We see it in our country. We see it in the church. Meanwhile, many are suffering either from the virus itself, they or a family member as it hits home, and or from economical trouble because of the lengthy lockdowns and shutdowns. Many are still suffering the effects of economics. Their finances are in shatters. Many people have lost their businesses, lost everything they've invested in. And so the result has been many have questioned their faith or abandoned it entirely. That's what we've been dealing with for the last 6 months, and there are probably many other things you could think of that we could throw in there. But I'll tell you, as 1 Peter 4:12-13 tells us, what we need to do to get through that fiery ordeal is have that strength, that endurance, and that trust in God that we keep on rejoicing. Saints today can still be forged in fire. Those who have trusted in God through these times have seen several positives come from this fiery ordeal, which only strengthened their faith in God. Those who were locked down with their families spent more time together. Spouses who work all the time were reacquainted with one another and reacquainted with their children. More opportunities to study the Bible were presented, either privately or at home together with their families. Individuals considered essential and still had to work saw greater appreciation for their job as people praised them privately and in public. As we all recognize the value of the grocery store worker, the value of the fast food worker, the restaurant worker, as we recognize the value of our healthcare members, things that we were just taking for granted, but they became rock stars and heroes to us during this lockdown. And I hope that you showed your appreciation to them as so many others have. Preachers and teachers, use technology in new ways, stepping out of their comfort zones to find new ways to keep their members and their students connected and engaged with one another so that no one felt abandoned or forgotten. More and more members who are still in lockdown for a host of reasons are remembered and contacted with greater frequency. This is based on my own personal conversations with them. Many of them have said since this time they received many more phone calls, texts, emails, and cards. And I think that is a very positive thing. Something that we were just taking for granted was brought to light so that we saw a need and we could reach out and let them know how much we love them. A greater appreciation for the things we easily take for granted was gained, such as eating out, going to the store. And I think a much greater appreciation was found for assembling with the saints. When we could no longer do it, we ached for it. We longed for it. Today was such a happy day that we were able to come in at 9:30 for Bible class for those that are able to meet in person for the first time since March. We looked forward to that. We've been working towards that. And I think we've all gained a greater appreciation for being together and seeing and hearing one another in person. Saints today are forged in fire to become conformed to the image of the Son of God. Romans chapter 8 and verse 29 tells us we are to be conformed to the image of the Son of God. We do that through endurance. We do that through perseverance. We do that through gaining the strength that we need to overcome any trials that come our way. There's an old saying, and that is that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. We see that with Moses. We see that with David. We can see that with so many others that we could read about. What about you? Are you that strongest steel? Can you endure the hottest of fires, or will you melt away? When the fiery ordeals arise, we need to remember it could be Satan testing God's commendation of us. Do you remember Job chapter 1, 6 through 12? God says to Satan, as Satan comes into his presence, he says, "If you considered my servant Job, who is upright and blameless, who walks with me," and Satan said, "Challenge accepted." Satan said, "Let me at him." And God said, "Spare his life." And everything was taken from Job. Maybe when we're going through that testing time, when we're going through that fiery ordeal, it could be because God wanted to prove a point to Satan. You can't break that person. Or what about it could be the testing we need to better serve God and others, as in the case of Saul of Tarsus. In Acts chapter 9, 15 to 16, Jesus told Ananias, "Go." And Ananias argued and said, "Don't you know who he is? We know who he is. We know what he's here to do." And Jesus said, "Go. He's a chosen instrument of mine. He will go before Gentiles and Jews, rulers and kings." Remember the next part? "He will learn what it means to suffer for my name's sake." The persecutor of the church became the persecuted for the church. It could be as we go through those fiery ordeals that it's a testing that we need to be there for someone else, to be in the right place at the right time, to help someone else maybe who's weaker, who might be struggling. The fire might be about to burn them up, and you've rescued them from that fire. Paul was able to know what it means to suffer for the name of Christ and give such strength and encouragement that here thousands of years later, we still draw on his words for encouragement. And think of what his last letter to Timothy must have been like. For Timothy to know, Paul's saying, "My execution is at hand. I'm already being poured out as a drink offering," in 2 Timothy 4, 6 to 8. And he says, "But I have kept the faith. I have fought the fight, and I have finished the course." Paul was able to say no matter what Satan threw at him, it only made him stronger. It only made him faster and more enduring. Some people get burned up and lost in their fires. Others are forged in the fire. And I'm reminded of Jesus' words in Mark 14, 14 to 20. "The rocky soil saint will fall away. The thorny soil saint will become unfruitful. But the good soil saint becomes fruitful." 60, 100-fold. Great Christians those are servants of God, are not born that way. They are forged. Whether we look at Moses or David, or we look at the apostles, we look at Saul of Tarsus, who became the apostle Paul. They weren't born that way. They had to undergo the fire to become the man and the servant that God needed them to be. Great Christians aren't born, they're forged. Will you be able to stand the heat? I want us to read from Hebrews chapter 10, 35 to 39 as we close. In Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 35, he says, "Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you've done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul." Will you be able to stand the heat and hear those words at the end? Well done, good and faithful servant. If you're not a Christian this morning, you need to be. To repent and be baptized into his name, to begin your journey. And yes, there will be times of forging. There will be times of testing. But you have a brotherhood to lean on. You have Jesus to lean on that you can keep rejoicing in. And we stand with you. And if you are a Christian this morning, not living the way that you should, are you faithfully abiding in Christ? And if the answer is no, the testing that you're undergoing could either burn you up or it could forge you into something stronger and better equipped to serve God and be an example for others. You need to repent and be renewed. Whatever your request might be this morning, we stand ready to assist you, whether it's the waters of baptism or the prayers of the congregation on your behalf. Come forward now, let it be known while we stand and sing.